My wife and kids send their apologies. They are currently on their way home from Tuscaloosa, having played basketball most of the day, and so they didn't make it home before I had to head this way, but they regret not being here. Great to be back and to see a lot of people I met before, some new faces that I don't remember meeting. Maybe I just missed you the first time, and I apologize. We're going to be talking about Nathan, so let's ask a couple of questions. Did Mr. Steve talk about Nathan last week when he talked about David? No. Yes. Okay, good. Other than my expert that's already talked to me, did y'all study about Nathan before you got here so you'd know who he was? How many looked him up? Be honest. One person. All right. So what do we know about Nathan? We'll start there tonight. We're only going to have 3 points. I'll go really quick. But what do we know about Nathan? I've got some things written down. What do y'all know?
He was a great prophet of God.
He was a great prophet of God. Cheater.
He was a brave man going to the king like he did.
Okay, brave man. He went to King David about David's sin. What else do we know? The big thing we remember about Nathan is when David sinned with Bathsheba, Nathan's the one that confronted him. We're going to spend some time with that because that's a really important interaction. Here's something that I know about Nathan. I know that he talked with David about religious things. Okay? He talked with David about religious things. You're going to see this twice at least. In 2 Samuel 7, verses 2 and 3. Now, David comes to Nathan, and you'll remember David, he's been a good king, especially at this point in time. He's been brave and courageous. He's given God the glory and the honor. He has conquered every enemy that Israel has had. And he's in a time of a little bit of peace. And one night he's sitting in his recliner. I don't know that he had a recliner. I've just always imagined him kicked back. Okay, that's just me. And he sees this great house he has, and he mentions the cedar beams. And he starts thinking about that old tent that the Ark of the Covenant's in. And thinking about that old tent that the priests have to haul around if it's moved. And he comes to Nathan, and we're going to call Nathan a good friend here, okay? He comes to his good friend and he says, Nathan, look, I've been thinking a lot about this. I want to build God a house. He's wanting to honor God. Him and Nathan discuss this in depth, right? Because initially, what does Nathan tell him to do? Somebody whispered it. What does Nathan tell David to do?
Go ahead.
Go ahead. Go build the house. Whatever's in your heart, the Lord's with you. You do that. Of course, we also remember the rest of the story. What happened that night? Nathan got reminded that Nathan wasn't in charge. God was. And so he had to go back to his good friend David and said, look, I kind of messed up yesterday. I said God said you could do it, and that wasn't really true. I just assumed it was okay, and you can't build the house. And he tells David why. You can look at 1 Samuel 7, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then you can go to First Chronicles 17. Kind of parallels the same thing. But basically it boiled down to that David had been a man of war and of bloodshed, and God wanted somebody else to build a temple that was associated with peace. It's not the only time that David and Nathan talked about religious things, even other than the sin with Bathsheba. If you read in 2 Chronicles 29 and verse 25, we think a lot about Solomon building the temple. But you know, David had a lot to do with the temple, because as soon as God said you can't build it, David started organizing and started buying supplies and started setting things in order. And in 2 Chronicles 29 and verse 25, it says, and he set the Levites in the house of the Lord with cymbals and psalteries, with harps, according to the commandment of David and of Gad, the king's seer, and of Nathan, the prophet. For For so was the commandment of the Lord by the prophets, or by His prophets. And so again, at some point in time, they're talking about tabernacle worship and temple worship, and Nathan and David and Gad, they're having this conversation, and Gad and Nathan say, look, you can have these singers, and you can have these instruments playing, because that's God's plan. That's God's way. Talks about religious things. I want you to think about, how often do you talk about religious things? This isn't a point, it's just a question. How often do you talk about religious things? Not enough. You know, I used to laugh because there used to be a saying, there's three things that nobody should talk about, and I don't even remember what they are now other than religion and politics, and there was something else I never could remember. Death, taxes, and religion. See, as a preacher, I talk about all three all the time. So, we need to talk about religious things. Have religious conversations with people. It's one of the things about Nathan that makes him a great prophet. He talked about godly things. Another thing we know about Nathan, and we've already mentioned this, we'll go through it quickly, but I do want to point it out. He confronts David about his sin. And I just want you to think about that. If Nathan and David are what we'll call friends, and I'm going to continue to make that as we go through some of the things we know about Nathan. If they're friends, can you imagine this conversation? David, you've sinned. David, you think you sinned in secret, but everybody knows about it. Thou art the man, David. That's one of the most chilling words that I read in most of the Old Testament. When Nathan is told this parable about this man with a little ewe lamb and how precious she was, and his rich neighbor takes it, and David's all angry and mad and said, that man's going to pay. And I don't know how Nathan said it. I don't know the expression on his face. But just to hear the words, David, thou art the man. Can you imagine the emotion going through Nathan as he has to utter that statement? Because let's face it, how many of y'all know somebody that has sinned? Okay, everybody's hand should be up, right? We all. How many of, and don't raise your hand for that, how many of y'all went and talked to that person? Imagine that if we're honest with ourselves, the hands that we raise first, a lot of us would go down, because most of us like to deal with sin in this way, right? Especially when it's somebody we know and we care about. In fact, it's odd. I'd rather tell a stranger that he's sinned and he needs to do what's right than go to somebody I've known most of my life, because I know that conversation is not going to go pleasant. Doesn't matter who it is. And with a stranger, you can just walk away, right? Nathan, David, you're that man. He confronted David about his sins. That's something big to know about Nathan. Here's something else, and it still revolves around David and his sin. He comforted David. He comforted David. In 2 Samuel 12, verses 24 and 25, God has punished David in several ways. One of those ways is that his child has died, and that was a question that was asked. And he pointed out he died after 7 days. We don't know how old the child was. We don't know if the child was just born and died 7 days later. I went and looked back on it right before we started just to make sure I was correct. We just know that she bare the son, and we know that at some point in time, Nathan came to David and confronted him. And part of the punishment is the child is going to die. And 7 days later, the child died. You know, when we deal with people and their sins, sometimes we get a little prideful, don't we? And we tend to kind of look down on people. We'll talk about a little bit about that. I want you to notice when when David repented, that was good with Nathan. And when David lost his child, and Bathsheba bore him another, guess who's there to welcome that child? Nathan is. In fact, David calls the child Solomon, but Nathan comes in and he calls him by a different name, Jedediah, beloved of God, or beloved of the Lord. If you're going to confront people about their sins, you also need to be there to comfort people when they repent, and to be there for them as they're recovering from the consequences of their sins. I think that's a great thing to know about Nathan. He was willing to go toe-to-toe with David about sin, but when David repented, he was also willing to open up his arms of love and to welcome David back. Another thing we know about Nathan, 1 Kings 1 and verse 11, is that Nathan reminded David of some promises David had made. David had promised that Solomon would be the king. That was a promise he made to Bathsheba. It's going to be a promise that God told him to make, and we'll see that when we come to a third point tonight. See, aren't you glad we hadn't even really got to any of the points? But Nathan comes to Bathsheba and says, look, David made you a promise. And then Nathan went to David and reminded him of that promise in 1 Kings chapter 1. Because one of David's other sons had said, look, I'm going to be king. I'm my dad's favorite. I'm the oldest left. I might say left because a lot of them have been killed at this point in time. I'm going to take over. And Nathan has to remind David. Great thing that you have somebody there that'll help you remember things that you have forgotten. Have y'all ever forgot anything important? Helpful when somebody's there, right? Another thing we know about Nathan, Nathan was an author. He wrote books. Okay? First Chronicles 29:29, 2 Chronicles 9 and verse 29, both reference the book of Nathan. Now, we don't know where these books are. We don't know what these books are. Some think that Nathan actually finished 2 Samuel, or that he actually wrote most of 2 Samuel after Samuel's death. Of course, we don't know that. But we do know that Nathan had a book that at least the peers of his day knew that he had written. So he was an author of religious writings, more than likely, because he was, guess what, a prophet of God. And the last thing I think important about about Nathan, is even after David was confronted by Nathan, even after Nathan was willing to tell him, you're a man of sin, David actually, possibly, I won't say actually, he possibly named a son after Nathan. Son Nathan is listed in 2 Samuel 5 and verse 14, 1 Chronicles 3 and verse 5, and then more importantly, all the way into Luke chapter 3 and verse 31, one of the sons of David. In fact, the lineage of Christ came through this son, and that was his son Nathan. Now, it could be coincidence that son is named Nathan, and prophet that is willing to talk to David about religious things and confront David about his sin and comfort David. I mean, it could be a coincidence, but I kind of doubt it, right? And this, I think, entails and shows us that Nathan and David were more than just king prophet. There was a relationship here. You know, I'm not going to name my son after somebody I really don't know, or especially if I don't like him. In fact, when my wife and I started talking about names for our kids, we had a list of names that were automatically off the table just because we knew people that had those names. And if we're honest, we couldn't stand them. So we didn't want any association with that, right? Nathan had a name that David used for one of his children. Possible relationship there. Everything we see about Nathan points him to be a man that is honorable and honest, that is loving and kind, that is strength under control, or what the Bible would call meek, willing to do the right thing. So that's our introduction. We now know just about everything we know about Nathan. I want to come back, and for our last little bit, what time's the bell going to ring? About 1:15. All right. Well, Wes said I could go as long as I wanted, but y'all went home at 8, so got some head shakes to that one. We're only going to talk about 3 things about Nathan. I want to come back and let us look at 3 of the most important things and just look at some lessons we can learn from this interaction. It's not necessarily about Nathan himself, but about the situation. So take your Bible out. Let's ponder some points and things we can walk away with. Number 1, when you think about Nathan's life and his interaction with David, it's a lesson that we need to be careful what we permit. We need to be careful what we permit. I'm going to go ahead and be honest, this point is not original to me. This is actually part of a bigger sermon that Charles Box wrote entitled, "You Better Ask God First." And so we'll keep some of those points. I didn't use all of them. But you'd better ask God first. Before we say something's okay, we better make sure that it is okay with God. So let's go ahead and open our Bibles. First Chronicles chapter 17. And we kind of alluded to it, we read it, but let's go ahead and read it in detail and see what happens. So let's read the first 4 verses. First Chronicles 17, 1 through 4. Anybody that wants to read, y'all more than welcome to.
And it came about when David dwelt in his house, that David said to Nathan the prophet, "Behold, I am dwelling in a house of cedar, but the ark of the covenant of the Lord is under curtains." Then Nathan said to David, "Do all that is in your heart, for God is with you." And it came about on the same night that the word of God came to Nathan, saying, "Go and tell David my servant, thus says the Lord, you shall not build a house for me to dwell in."
I want you to think about it for just a second. David, a man after God's own heart, David, a godly man, comes to you, says, "This is what I want to do." What's your response? Sounds good to me. Isn't that Nathan's response? Sounds good. When God's with you, we know you're blessed. You have good intentions. You go ahead and do that. And then to have to come back the next day and say, "Well, actually God told me last night that you can't do that." That's not going to be a very happy moment for Nathan, is it? We need to be careful in the same way that we don't permit things that God does not approve of. So before we tell somebody something is okay, we might need to learn from Nathan here and take a step back and say, well, let's ask what God thinks first. And there's a lot of things that you could apply this to as far as doctrinal positions, instrumental music. This was one of my things. I didn't grow up in the church. I grew up in a denomination. I love bluegrass music. Listen to a lot of instrumental gospel music. I never was in a quartet because, let's just be honest, I can't sing. But growing up, I had no problem with instrumental music when it came to worship. And I remember having a conversation with my wife at one point in time, and this was my argument. I don't think God really cares. I don't think He cares if I play a piano or a banjo or a violin or a fiddle. He doesn't care. And I got really mad at my wife when I walked into church that Sunday morning with her, And her uncle preached on instrumental music and how the fact God does care. And we had a knockdown, drag-out, good fight about that one, simply because I thought she had called and told him what I said, and he promised me that he didn't. He had just planned on preaching on that. But a lot of times you'll hear people say something like that when it comes to instrumental music. Well, I know it's not found in the New Testament per se, but God's not going to care. Better ask Him first, right? And if you ask God, what do you think about instrumental music? And you go to the New Testament, what do you find? Nothing. There's no instruments in the New Testament apart from a harp or a trumpet, neither of which are used in worship. What does God say about singing in the New Testament in regards to the church? Okay? Singing with grace in our heart or making melody in our heart. We're speaking to one another in psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. We're letting the words of Christ dwell in us richly, teaching and admonishing one another, again in psalms, hymns, or spiritual songs, singing with grace in our hearts to the Lord. And then notice Colossians 3, verse 17. Whatever we do in word or deed, do what? Okay, what does that mean? Okay, do what God has permitted you to do, what He's allowed. Now, I know from some of our religious neighbors, they would permit instrumental music. But if God doesn't permit it, who are we to say that it's okay? That it's allowed? Or, some people will belittle the Bible. It's just a book of good advice. It's an old book and it's important, but God's more worried about this right here than this right here. Y'all heard that before? Studied with a person, not last week, I was out of town, but 2 weeks ago, and that was their whole argument. The Bible wasn't a rule book, it was just maybe an encouraging book, an inspirational book, and as long as you felt God here, you were fine. Now, before I belittle the Scriptures, I might need to ask God how He feels about them, right? You look at Psalms 19 and verse 7, the law of the Lord is what? Perfect. Converting the soul. The testimony of the Lord is sure, making wise the simple. We know that we're going to know the truth, and the truth will make you free, John 8, verse 32. But like Pilate, let's ask the question, what is truth? What is truth? Okay. Whatever God said. In John 17 and verse 17, sanctify them in truth. Thy word is truth, right? And so before we say something negative about the Scriptures, or before we allow somebody to say things negative about the Scriptures, we might step back and ask God first. God, how do you feel about the Bible? How do you feel about the Scriptures that Paul said you had inspired and that is profitable for everything we need to be thoroughly furnished into all good works? Maybe ask God first. What about the church? Don't you know one church is just as good as another? Attend the church of your choice. Before we think about those things, before we allow people to belittle the church, we'd better ask God first, right? Because I don't want to be like Nathan and say, yeah, David, build you a temple because it's not that important. You can do it. Because if the church is important to God, it's important to me, right? So how important is the church to God? Acts 20:28 says that He has purchased it. In Matthew 16, verse 18, the future tense, He will build His church as His. And we are to love our wives even as Christ loved the church. Now, if somebody starts bad-mouthing your wife, what are you going to do? Set him straight. Who was the brave man that said that? I didn't. Every man's hand when I was one. Just depends on if she's pregnant or not. I'm pregnant, present or not, right? Y'all remember Will Smith slapped Chris Rock? Y'all know the funniest thing to me about that? If you watch the video clips, Will Smith is laughing until he looks over at his wife and she's not. If somebody badmouth my wife, we're going to have a conversation, right? Well, if somebody badmouths or belittles the church, or we let that go, we might want to ask God, how important is the church to you? Talk about baptism. We've got to hurry. I've only made it through one point. Now, you don't have to be baptized. That's what I said. I asked God to forgive me, and the moment that I asked Him, Jesus came into my heart and I was saved. The only problem is, you never find that here. So before I say baptism isn't essential, before I belittle this act that God commands, better make sure I ask Him first, right? Because according to Peter, baptism saves us, 1 Peter 3:21. According to Jesus, he that believeth and is baptized is saved. And according to Paul, Nicodemus told him that he had to arise and be baptized to have his sins washed away. Right? So these are things that for us maybe tonight, they're easy because we know them, right? But what about other things? And I knew I wasn't going to have a lot of time, so I'm not going to address these. I just want you to think about them. I better ask God first about modesty. Men and women. I'm not going to pick on the women only. Men and women. I better ask God first before I think about drinking alcoholic beverages. I better ask God first before I neglect Bible study or prayer or creation or marriage and divorce and remarriage. There's a lot of other things, aren't there? In fact, if you want to, we could make it just a list, and if you'll provide a list and verses, I can add them to the sermon and I'll preach them again. There's a lot of things that we better stop before we say it's okay, and make sure we have consulted with God, and make sure that what we are condoning, God is permitting. Questions, comments? I only got 5 minutes to go through 2 more points. We're going to micro machine this one. We need to be ready to confront sin. I asked the question earlier, if your friend sins, how are you going to feel about having to go to him? Because the reality is, Nathan teaches us that it doesn't matter who the person is. If God has revealed to us that they have sinned, if we know it, then we have an obligation to confront them. And I'm using the word confront intentionally. I don't think you need to be mean. We'll talk about that. But you do have to recognize there's a problem and fix that issue. So if we can learn from Nathan, we need to be ready to confront sin. Nathan tells this beautiful story. He's a master at it. I mean, he sets David up perfectly. And David falls right into the trap. David very passionately jumps up. His anger is kindled. 2 Samuel 12 and verse 5. And he says, that man has done this thing shall surely die. Nathan then utters those words, thou art the man. We have to realize that if we're going to be faithful to God, there are going to be times in our life when we have to sit down in front of somebody and we have to tell them, we love you, we want you to repent because you've done something wrong. Those conversations aren't easy. But sin has to be confronted. Whether it's earnestly contending for the faith in Jude verse 3, whether it is confronting a false teacher, Titus 1 verses 9 through 11. Incidentally, that's the elders, but that would be all of our responsibility. Sin has to be confronted. In 2 John 1, because there's only one chapter, I guess I should have taken that out. Verses 10 and 11, if there come any unto you and bring not this doctrine, receive him not into your house, neither bid him Godspeed. For he that biddeth him Godspeed is a partaker of his evil deeds. Now you'll remember that God told Ezekiel that he was to watch and warn. And that if he watched and he warned when God gave the warning, then the people would answer to God for what they had done. But if he watched and he didn't warn when God gave a warning, not only would they answer for their sins, but God says their blood would be upon Ezekiel's hands. So it's not easy to think about, but the truth is we have to confront sin. Now, let's make sure that we confront sin correctly. Notice Nathan came in. What did Nathan do? He told a story. He told a story that David could relate to. He told a story that had a meaning. And he told a story that had a purpose he was going to get to. But Nathan didn't just come in guns a-blazing. Okay? One of the mistakes we make when we talk to people about their sins is we come in loaded for bear. Okay? And sometimes you need to do that. But more often the case, you need to come in, well, as Jesus would tell his disciples, be you wise as serpents and as harmless as doves, right? So we need to make sure that we confront sin correctly. There comes a time when you go in guns blazing, but most often you need to go in very, very lovingly and kindly. And I like Galatians 6 and verse 1 when we're talking about individuals in sin. You remember Paul said, brethren, if a man be overtaken in a fault, ye which are spiritual, restore such a one in the spirit of meekness, considering thyself first, lest thou also be tempted. Confront the sin, confront the situation, but deal with it in a spirit of love and of hope. In 2 Timothy 2, verse 25, Paul tells Timothy that in the spirit of meekness instruct those that oppose themselves. And of course, Matthew 7, the most quoted verses when you confront somebody about their sins, judge not lest you be judged, right? But what was Jesus' point there? Don't make a big deal out of a little mote in his eye when you're walking around with a beam of sin hanging out your own eye, right? So consider yourself first and go to that person in meekness. And secondly, confront with love. Speak the truth in love, Ephesians 4 and verse 15. In 1 John 3 and verse 18, we are to love in word or in deed and in truth, not just in words. not just in a tongue, but truly love that person. I remember one time that a man that I know had done something really bad. He had gotten caught. It was in the newspaper. He knew everybody knew about it. And I dreaded going to talk to him. And I sat down across the table, and we were in his kitchen, and he said, "I know why you're here." He said, "And I know that you're afraid to talk right now, aren't you?" And I said, "Yes, sir, my heart's going about 3 miles an hour right now." And he goes, 3 miles? I said, "Yeah, normally it's only going about 1 mile an hour because I don't like to get really excited." And he said, "I appreciate you showing up." He said, "There's a lot of people talking about me right now, but you came because you cared." People know how much you care. They might not like you being there, but they will come to appreciate that you care. So when you confront sin, confront it in love. Last point we're not going to get to, but it builds off this confronting sin. Be ready to remind people. Most people, if they do something wrong, most of the time it's just because they didn't realize it. David had kind of lost his facilities. He had gotten old, and he just didn't remember that promise. In 1 Kings 1, David had to be reminded, and that's what Nathan did. He just reminded David, do what's right. Do what you promised to do. People around you, if they're religious people, most of them know what the Bible teaches. They just need to be reminded to listen to it. Let's remind each other to listen to the Scriptures. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for allowing me to be here. And Lord willing, we will walk together, and one day, if not in this world, we'll see each other in heaven. You need this back, or...